The Time Gates Rebellion, written by Karl-Heinz Schratt in 2006. All rights reserved. Visit schratzarts.wordpress.com for more creative works and information. Spelling of Schratzarts: SCHRADTZ The Time Gates Rebellion. Prologue. A dark reign of 1,000 years. The distant future is bleak. The Kaldros dome had crushed its enemies with terrifying ease, reigning supreme. The universe's population had fallen victim to a single, mighty invention that cemented the Kaldros' dominance: the gravatas. Conceived by Ilores, the Kaldros' dark and brilliant scientist, the gravatas device defied imagination. It manipulated gravitational forces, rendering traditional fuel-based space travel obsolete. The Kaldros' armies could harness the pull of distant planets, suns, and even black holes to conquer the universe. Entire civilizations crumbled, unable to withstand the Kaldros dome's might. Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The Kaldros does not recognize defeat, the monarch thundered. He stood before the throne, his robed figure commanding the cavernous hall. The flickering light of torches cast long shadows, and his glowing yellow eyes burned with malice. Before him, Prince Sorrel and General Mardovic knelt on the cold marble floor, their heads bowed in submission. The silence was oppressive. Along the walls, the Kaldros' elite guard, the Karnos, stood motionless, their armor gleaming like obsidian. "You," the Kaldros roared, "my chosen leaders have failed me. You have nothing to fear but the shame of admitting your incompetence." The Kaldros descended the stairs, his crimson cape flowing behind him like a river of blood. He moved with an eerie grace, his feet never touching the ground. Hovering before the two men, his gaze darkened, his eyes flaring blood red. "For 1,000 years, I have ruled this universe. I am the suns, the stars, the past, and the future. I am all things to all people." His voice resonated like thunder, shaking the walls. Prince Sorrel dared to glance upward, terror etched across his face. In an instant, the Kaldros' hands lashed out, gripping Sorrel and Mardovic by their throats. "I ordered you to deliver the deaths of the last free rebels," he growled. "Instead, I will deliver yours." The two men gasped and clawed at the Kaldros' steely grip, their struggles futile. Their lives were slipping away when a calm, measured voice interrupted. "My Kaldros." The Kaldros paused, turning his fiery gaze toward the doorway. A silver figure stood there, draped in royal purple robes. Ilores, the Kaldros' dark scientist, floated into the room, his mechanical frame gleaming. "Ilores," the Kaldros snarled, his tone a mix of recognition and warning. Ilores inclined his head. "Your prince has devised an intriguing strategy." The Kaldros' eyes flicked to his captives. With a flick of his wrists, he hurled them across the room. They slid to a halt at Ilores' feet, gasping for breath. "Speak," the Kaldros commanded, ascending the stairs to his throne. Ilores spread his arms in a sweeping gesture. "Though Prince Sorrel failed to breach the Genoan solar system, he has secured a meeting." "A meeting?" the Kaldros repeated, disdain dripping from the words. "Yes, my lord. An ambassador from the Genoans will arrive at the Guild of Mars to negotiate peace." Ilores delivered the word with deliberate precision. The Kaldros' laughter was sharp and cruel. "Peace?" Still kneeling, Sorrel found his voice. "The ambassador's trust will be earned, my Kaldros. When they return to Genoan, we will use the opportunity to learn their defenses." Ilores added, "A drone craft, hidden aboard the ambassador's ship, would gather invaluable intelligence as it navigates their asteroid defenses." The Kaldros' glowing eyes bore into his son. "And what bargain led to this opportunity?" Sorrel's voice wavered. "I know in general, from the Battle of Taurus. They expect a fair meeting, Father, my Kaldros." The Kaldros's expression twisted with contempt, but Ilores interjected smoothly. "For the ruse to succeed, the prince must attend. The Genoans must believe in our sincerity." The throne room held its breath. Finally, the Kaldros growled, "Sorrel and Mardovic will go to the Guild of Mars. They will either secure victory or meet their end before the next quantization." Sorrel bowed stiffly, his neck still aching. "Thank you, my Kaldros." He and Mardovic retreated, the heavy doors closing behind them with a resounding thud. Ilores floated closer to the throne. "Your Grace, Sorrel is far from your strongest warrior, but he may yet prove useful." The Kaldros's voice was icy. "I do not trust him, Ilores. You will be his shadow." "As always, I am yours to command," Ilores replied, bowing deeply. Chapter 2. 100 starships or more, each emblazoned with the Kaldros's seal, surged through the void of space toward Mars. Traveling at speeds far beyond the comprehension of most, they carved glowing trails across the darkness, like harbingers of destruction. At the heart of the fleet aboard the command ship, Prince Sorrel and General Mardovic stood on the bridge. Sorrel's hand lingered on the bruises encircling his neck, the marks of his father's wrath still raw. He winced as the pain flared anew. "What say you, Mardovic?" he asked, his tone sharp despite the injury. The seasoned general turned to face the prince, his features shadowed by years of war and service. Once a member of the elite Karnos, he had since traded his ceremonial armor for the mantle of leadership over the Kaldros's armies. "Our time grows short, my prince," Mardovic replied, his voice low and gravelly. "The Kaldros will not accept further failure. He will demand results." Sorrel's lips curved into a thin smile, though his eyes betrayed no amusement. "This plan will gain us time. I will tell my father that the drone craft's data is promising but complex. That will delay his expectations." He crossed his arms and stared out at the stars beyond the ship's viewing pane. "Our mining operation on Jupiter has given us the capital we need. Soon we'll have the armies to hold the palace and destroy the time gates, should it come to that. The royal armies will follow my command long enough for us to secure our position. The plan hinges on the Genoan ambassador returning the drone craft to Genoan," Mardovic said, his tone laced with caution. Sorrel turned, a glimmer of confidence in his eyes. "He will, and to ensure it, I have a gift that will make him trust me." Mardovic's brow furrowed. "A gift?" Sorrel's sly smile widened. "Gravatis." The general's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're giving the Genoans Gravatis." "Not entirely," Sorrel replied. "When the Genoans integrate Gravatis into their fleets, it will disrupt the Kaldrosdom's balance. Chaos will ensue, and in that chaos, we'll find our opportunity to unseat my father. We can bring sanity to this universe." Mardovic's expression remained grim, but he nodded. "As you wish, my prince." Act 1. The Tralonu Destiny. Chapter 3. Teresa Manak stood at the window of her small home in San Gimignano, staring out at the silhouette of the town's medieval towers. The summer night was stifling, and she had opened the window to let a faint breeze in for her sleeping baby, Shania. Even in the darkness, the shapes of the ancient towers were distinct against the starry sky. Life in this quiet Tuscan town had been kind to her. She and her husband, Vandar, ran a modest shop together, a far cry from the life they had left behind. Vandar stirred in his sleep, the sheets tangled around him. To Teresa, it seemed like any other restless night. But within Vandar's mind, old memories surfaced like dark waves crashing against a fragile shore. Sarus Danak, commander of the 5th Fleet's garrisons, stood at the podium in the stormtroopers' briefing room. Before him stretched a sea of armored soldiers, their black uniforms shining under the harsh lights. They stood at rigid attention, awaiting his command. Sarus removed his helmet, revealing a face hardened by years of war. His piercing gaze swept across the room, and his voice boomed with authority. "The people you encounter are traitors. Show them no mercy," he declared. A murmur rippled through the assembled troops, their anticipation palpable. All who defy the Kaldrosdom, no matter their age, gender, or station, must be eradicated. They threaten the rule of the Kaldros and the safety of his subjects. He raised a fist, his voice growing louder. They will be annihilated. The soldiers roared in response, their voices a thunderous echo of the commander's rage. Moments later, the fleet's largest transport ship touched down on the outskirts of Balzac City, a mining colony on the young planet Ethsis. The city, a cluster of industrial buildings, was surrounded on all sides by the Kaldros' forces. Vandar Manak, now a squadron leader, rode in the first wave of transports. Through the visor of his helmet, he scanned his soldiers. Their faces were obscured, their loyalty absolute. Vandar himself had once been no different. "Do we hold until the target is confirmed?" his communications officer Theron asked. "No," Vandar replied coldly. "You heard the orders. If they're not ours, kill them." The transports rumbled into the city square, meeting sporadic resistance. Civilians screamed and scattered as stormtroopers marched forward. Snipers fired from windows, but their efforts were futile. The Kaldros' forces crushed all opposition with ruthless efficiency. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the square. Vandar turned to see one of the transports reduced to a flaming wreck. "Take cover!" he shouted, leading his men to shelter behind a subway entrance. Laser fire rained down from the surrounding buildings. Several soldiers fell, their armor no match for the onslaught. Vandar scanned the upper floors, his targeting system searching for enemies. Then he saw them. 6 figures shrouded in green light, floating effortlessly through the smoky air. The Karnos. The Kaldros' elite bodyguards moved like phantoms, their black capes billowing as fiery orbs formed above their palms. Without a word, the orbs streaked toward the snipers, exploding on impact and engulfing entire floors in flames. Vandar watched in awe as the Karnos methodically obliterated the enemy. Their shields absorbed every shot, their movements impossibly fast. Within moments, the resistance was quelled. The buildings crackled with fire, and the screams of the wounded faded into silence. Chapter 4. The blockade at the building's entrance was obliterated in seconds, Vandar explosives reducing it to a heap of smoking rubble. He and his unit stormed through, blasters raised, moving with precision honed by years of combat. The rebel stronghold was a maze of tight corridors and makeshift barricades, but their mission was simple: eliminate everyone. The assault lasted 4 grueling days. Explosions rocked the city as guerrilla warfare consumed every street and building. For Vandar, every kill brought satisfaction. A traitor's life extinguished, one less threat to the Kaldrosdom. By the end, the resistance was broken, reduced to scattered survivors making futile last stands. Vandar's final kill on Ethsis was seared into his memory. His unit was returning to their transport, the mission complete, when a noise stopped him. He turned, blaster raised, as a figure emerged from the rubble of a collapsed apartment block. A girl, no older than 17, stumbled toward him. Her hair was matted with blood and ash, her face streaked with soot. She screamed, her voice cracking with grief and rage. "You killed him!" she shrieked, her steps faltering as tears streamed down her face. "My little brother! You bastards, you killed him!" Vandar didn't hesitate. She was unarmed, hysterical, and an easy target. He waited just long enough for her to finish her sentence, then fired a single, perfect shot. She fell, disappearing into the ruins. He approached the body, scanning the rubble until he found her. Her eyes were wide, her expression frozen in anguish. Vandar felt nothing. He sneered inwardly, thinking, at least she got to say her piece. In his dream, the scene replayed, but this time it was different. He wasn't the hardened soldier anymore. He was himself, as he was now. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He gasped for air, his chest tightening as if an iron grip held him. He collapsed to his knees, bile rising in his throat. The faces of the people he'd killed flooded his mind. Their screams filled his ears, drowning out everything else. He clawed at his chest, desperate to rid himself of the evil he felt coursing through him. I don't deserve this life, he thought. I'm a monster. His comrades in the dream rushed to his side, shouting in confusion. What's wrong with him? One yelled. He's lost it. Another cried, panic in his voice. Vandar screamed, his voice raw and ragged. Their hands grabbed at him, trying to restrain him, but he didn't fight back. He didn't care. All he wanted was to be destroyed, to erase himself from existence. Vandar woke with a gasp, his heart pounding. The sunlight streaming through the window felt wrong. Too bright, too warm. He sat up, struggling to catch his breath. Slowly, the sounds of morning seeped in, birds chirping outside, the faint creak of the house settling. He wasn't on Eths's, he was home. Teresa, he called, his voice shaky. She appeared in the doorway, her brow furrowed with concern. Vandar, are you okay? You look terrible. He ran a hand through his damp hair. I didn't sleep well, he admitted. Teresa sat beside him, taking his hand. I noticed. I went to check on Shania around 1 a.m, and you were thrashing in your sleep. He sighed, leaning back against the headboard. It was the dreams again. The past. Her hand stroked his hair gently. You're not that man anymore, she said softly. That life is behind you now. He looked at her, her serene smile grounding him. The warmth of her touch eased the knot in his chest. For a moment he allowed himself to believe her. Well, she added with a teasing grin, the good news is it's the weekend. Vandar chuckled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Does it really count as a weekend if I have to see your dad? Teresa smirked. Yes, it does, and you're the one who can explain everything best. He respects you. Plus, he loves technical talk. He'll follow the science. Lucky me, Vandar said, leaning in to kiss her. I'll make it work. As he dressed, the remnants of his dream lingered, but he pushed them aside. He couldn't change the past, but his future, with Teresa and Shania, was something he could protect. And that made all the difference. Chapter 5. It was the end of a tranquil day in Arezzo, a picturesque town nestled in the Tuscan hills. The winter sky was ablaze with crimson and gold as the sun sank below the horizon. Vandar walked through the narrow cobblestone streets, the air cool and tinged with the faint aroma of wood smoke. He stopped in front of the villa of his father-in-law, Signore Gino Forlanini, a retired English lecturer known for his sharp wit and love of philosophy. Gino, the father of Vandar's wife, Teresa, was a man who valued tradition but relished a good debate. Vandar and Teresa had been married for years and were blessed with a daughter, Shania. Tonight, however, Vandar arrived alone. He was invited onto a small veranda just big enough for 2 chairs. It overlooked a lively piazza, where townsfolk lingered in the last light of day. Gino poured a glass of wine and settled into his worn wooden stool, lighting a cigarette with practiced ease. His weathered face broke into a sly grin as he addressed his son-in-law. "You've come alone, Vandar. Where are Teresa and little Shania?" "They're waiting for me in San Gimignano," Vandar replied, his voice steady yet burdened. "I came alone because there's something I need to say to you." Teresa thought it was important. Gino raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. An important message delivered in person. "Intriguing. I'm an old man, Vandar. Say what you must quickly, before I keel over and take your words to the grave." He chuckled, but the humor faded as he noticed Vandar's somber expression. "This isn't an easy conversation, Gino, but I need you to listen carefully." The older man exhaled a plume of smoke, his gaze sharp. He gestured with his hand, inviting Vandar to continue. "You've probably thought of me as eccentric," Vandar began, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Perhaps even a little mad." "Certainly not without reason," Gino quipped, his grin returning. Vandar looked out at the piazza below, where the fading daylight cast long shadows. "What I'm about to tell you may seem like proof of that belief, but I assure you, it's no whimsy, it's truth. And Teresa insisted you had a right to know." Gino's grin faded as he leaned forward, his curiosity giving way to cautious attention. Vandar took a deep breath. "Most people accept the future as unpredictable, shaped by random events and chance, but I know otherwise." The old man tilted his head, skepticism flickering in his eyes. "I've seen the centuries ahead," Vandar said. His tone was calm, but his words carried weight. "And before I explain what awaits, I need to tell you why I know it to be certain." Gino stubbed out his cigarette, giving his son-in-law his full attention. "First, a refresher on gravity," Vandar began. "It's the force that pulls objects together. It keeps us on this planet, binds the moon in its orbit, and shapes the cosmos. Some even believe it will bring about the universe's end." Gino nodded, his intellect engaged. "And time. Time is more elusive," Vandar said, his voice growing quieter. "Though it seems constant in our daily lives, it bends under the influence of gravity, as Einstein described. And at extreme speeds, time becomes malleable." Vandar leaned forward, his tone intensifying. "Travel fast enough, and time slows for the traveler while the universe moves on. Travel even faster, and time for the universe stops. Push beyond that, and time reverses." Gino gave a skeptical laugh. "So, you're telling me you've traveled to the future?" Vandar raised a hand, his eyes serious. "Hear me out. The key isn't speed alone. It's gravity. With control over gravity, speed becomes limitless. And with speed, time becomes a tool, not a boundary." Vandar gestured toward the coffee table, picking up an apple. "Take this apple. Gravity pulls it down, as it did for Newton. But what if I could make it fall upward?" He dropped the apple, and it thudded onto the wooden floor. "Now, imagine replacing this apple with a spacecraft. With control over gravity, it could fall not just upward, but through the vast expanse of space, accelerating past light speed." Gino folded his arms, his expression guarded. Vandar met his gaze, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This isn't theoretical, it's real, and it's already been done. But here's the truth you need to understand. Everything today is a consequence of yesterday. The future depends on the past staying exactly as it is." "What are you saying, Vandar?" Gino asked, his voice low. Vandar straightened, his face grave. "We are in the past, Gino. Our future descendants are holding us here, trapped in time. They control the past to secure their existence." Gino sat back, his cigarette forgotten. "Why? Why meddle with what's done?" Vandar looked away, his voice heavy with regret. "Because the only threat to the future is the past." Gino's hands tightened around his glass, his thoughts racing. "If I trust you, what must I do?" Vandar extended a hand. "Pack your things. Come with me. There's no going back if you do. Teresa wanted you to have this choice." After a long pause, Gino slapped Vandar on the arm, a grin spreading across his face. "I'm old, Vandar. I need an adventure. Lead the way." Vandar grinned back. "We leave for San Gimignano tonight. From there, London." And with that, the two men stepped into the unknown. Chapter 6. The drive to San Gimignano was swift, and Gino's mood lightened as he reunited with Teresa and his infant granddaughter Shania. His face softened as he cradled the baby in his arms, marveling at her wide-eyed innocence. Yet, beneath his jovial exterior, Vandar noticed a flicker of hesitation in the old man's eyes, a silent recognition of the life he was about to leave behind. From San Gimignano, they drove to Pisa to catch a late-night flight to London. The transition felt surreal, as though the familiar landmarks of Tuscany were slipping away like grains of sand through an hourglass. At the airport, Gino lingered by a cafe window, his gaze fixed on the rolling hills in the distance, before Teresa gently ushered him onward. The family spent the night at a modest hotel near Heathrow. The following morning, the quiet hum of city life seeped into their breakfast conversation as Vandar laid out the next step of their journey. "We'll need to hire a car and drive out of London to Stonehenge," he said, his voice clipped with purpose. Gino, stirring sugar into his espresso, nodded casually. "That's fine, but I'd like to make a brief stop in central London first. There's something I need to take care of." Vandar paused, his spoon hovering midair over his coffee. What could be so important? "You do understand, Gino. You're leaving your life behind. After this, nothing about your world will remain the same." "I haven't forgotten," Gino replied, his tone light. "It's just a quick stop. There's a language institute I've been working with. I was supposed to finalize a contract to edit their next Italian language book." Vandar sighed, running a hand through his hair. Before he could respond, Teresa intervened, her voice calm but firm. "Father," she said, setting down her teacup, "after you come with us, you'll no longer exist in the timeline as it is now. Anything you do, this book, this contract, it will all disappear by the next new year. The time gates will erase your presence." Gino furrowed his brow, the weight of her words settling over him. "Erase?" he echoed. "Once you pass through the gates, you're essentially removed from history as far as it's recorded," Teresa explained, glancing at Vandar. "If you stay behind after Stonehenge, you'll reintegrate into the timeline. But until then, nothing you do will have any lasting impact." Gino chuckled, a hint of defiance in his tone. "Well, isn't that something? But I've always found editing a language book to be quite a satisfying exercise. If it's all the same to you, I'd like to finish what I started." Vandar leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. "Fine," he said at last. "We'll go to the Institute, but after that, no more detours." A short drive later, they entered central London, its streets bustling with early morning energy. The car stopped outside a stately Victorian building with ornate brickwork and tall windows that reflected the gray sky. A brass plaque beside the door read, "The Language Teachers Institute." "This is it," Gino announced, his excitement barely contained. "Care to join me?" Teresa shook her head, adjusting Shania's baby carrier. "I'll stay here, maybe take Shania for a walk. Vandar, you go with him." Vandar hesitated, but eventually followed the older man. Gino climbed the steep stone steps slowly, steadying himself on the railing. Vandar, noticing the strain on his father-in-law's face, reached out. "Here, let me take the briefcase." "Thank you," Gino said, flashing a grateful smile. Age catches up with us all, doesn't it? Inside, the reception area was warm and welcoming, its walls adorned with maps and posters of European landmarks. A cheerful receptionist greeted them. "Senor Forlanini," she exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. "What a pleasure to meet you in person." "The pleasure is mine," Gino replied, his tone as bright as the woman's smile. "If you have a moment, Mr. Walker would be happy to see you," she added. They were soon ushered into a cozy office where Mr. Walker, the Institute's general manager, greeted them with enthusiasm. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper, its shelves lined with language textbooks. "Signore Forlanini, we're thrilled to have you on board for this project," Walker said, shaking his hand warmly. "And I'm delighted to be part of it," Gino replied, his voice carrying genuine pride. Walker glanced at Vandar. "And you must be—" "My son-in-law," Gino said, "Vandar Manak." Walker studied Vandar for a moment, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Manak, an unusual name. Eastern European?" Vandar hesitated, then nodded. "Something like that?" Walker seemed satisfied, turning his attention back to Gino. "Well, Signore Forlanini, everything seems to be in order. If you'll sign here, we'll send the first manuscripts to your Arezzo address by March." Gino signed the contract with deliberate care, his pen scratching across the paper. For a brief moment he seemed lost in thought, his fingers lingering on the final page. As they descended the stairs, Gino stopped abruptly. "You know," he said, glancing back at Vandar, "this book might never see the light of day, but it feels good to leave something behind, even if it's just for myself." Vandar frowned but said nothing. Back at the car, Teresa asked, "How did it go?" "Very well," Gino replied, his face alight with satisfaction. "It's a good project, a fine opportunity." Vandar glanced at her and Shania, who gurgled contentedly in her mother's arms. "The people there seemed nice enough," he said. "It's a shame it'll all disappear." As they drove away from the city, the bustling streets gave way to the quiet expanse of the English countryside. Gino sat silently, gazing out the window as though committing every detail to memory. "Wait," he suddenly exclaimed. "I left my briefcase at the Institute?" Vandar sighed, shaking his head. "We'll pick it up on the way back," he said, his voice resigned. Teresa chuckled softly, patting Vandar's arm. "He's still attached to the little things," she said. As the car sped towards Stonehenge, the horizon stretched wide and unbroken, a reminder of the unknown that lay ahead. Chapter 7. The frosty English countryside unfolded like a watercolor painting, mist clinging to the fields and frost sparkling on the grass under a pale winter sun. Gino watched the scenery with interest, the unfamiliar chill biting through his coat. England was starkly different from Tuscany, colder, more subdued, but beautiful in its own way. His thoughts, however, were far from the landscape. In the back seat, Teresa cradled Shania, who had fallen peacefully asleep after her milk. Vandar glanced at them through the rearview mirror. Teresa's long dark hair framed her serene expression, and Shania's tiny hand rested on her mother's chest. Vandar's heart swelled as he thought about how much they had changed his life. Before them, he'd been unmoored, drifting through life without purpose. Now, they were his world. He couldn't lose them. Teresa broke the silence. "I'm sorry I didn't explain everything to you myself, Dad. I didn't think I could make you understand." Gino gave a soft chuckle, though his eyes stayed on the passing fields. "I'm not sure I understand even now." "I'm glad you're here," Teresa said, touching his arm with a gentle smile. Gino smiled back. "So, where are we headed?" Vandar spoke without looking away from the road. We're driving to the ley lines near Stonehenge. It's one of the most powerful intersections in the world. Gino raised an eyebrow. Ley lines? What exactly are those? Vandar hesitated, as if searching for the simplest explanation. Think of them as pathways of energy. Just like gravity creates patterns in the universe, these lines mirror those patterns on Earth. They're places where the forces of the universe behave differently. As on Earth, so it is in the heavens, Gino murmured, recalling the words of his Sunday prayers from decades ago. Vandar nodded. Exactly. We need to position ourselves on the ley lines before midnight on New Year's Eve. That's when the time gates reset history. Teresa added, At midnight, the gates perform something called the quantization. They align the past with the universe's intended history, correcting any anomalies. Gino smirked. So we're spending New Year's Eve in the middle of a field, hiding from what? Cosmic accountants? Vandar allowed a faint smile, but stayed focused on the road. It's not just about the quantization. The ley lines are the only places immune to the gate's effects, but that also makes them dangerous. They're often guarded. Gino turned in his seat to face him. And you think risking Teresa and Shania is worth this madness? Vandar met Gino's gaze briefly in the mirror. If we don't, Shania will cease to exist. Teresa won't remember me, and you'll forget all of this ever happened. Gino stared at him, stunned. Cease to exist? He repeated, his voice rising. I love my family. I won't let that happen. Teresa reached out to take her father's hand. I know it's hard to believe, Dad, but please, trust us. For a moment, Gino said nothing, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. Finally, he sighed, looking out at the frost-covered fields. Madness, he muttered. Pure madness. Chapter 8. The stark silhouette of Stonehenge rose before them, its ancient stones bathed in the pale light of a cloudy afternoon. Gino felt a momentary awe as he walked among the massive monoliths, pushing Shania's pram over the uneven ground. The baby cooed happily, her joy infectious. And for a while, Gino allowed himself to focus on her, rather than the strange circumstances that had brought them here. Vandar and Teresa lagged behind, poring over a map and speaking in hushed tones. Gino glanced back at them occasionally, watching his son-in-law with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Vandar seemed focused, too focused, and it unsettled him. What's your daddy doing, Shania? Gino asked the baby as he glanced toward Vandar. Shania babbled in response, waving her tiny fists. Gino followed her gaze to where Vandar now stood alone, eyes closed, clutching his peculiar metal bracelet. He stayed like that for minutes, motionless, as if communing with the ancient stones. Ha perso le retel, Gino muttered to himself, shaking his head. He's lost the plot. When they regrouped at the exit, Teresa smiled as she took Shania into her arms. Vandar, still preoccupied, glanced back at the stones with an intensity that unsettled Gino. I think I've found the right spot, Vandar said. We'll need to wait until midnight tomorrow. Any hotel nearby will do for now, Teresa said, eager to rest. Gino nodded, relieved. Finally, some sense. Chapter 9. The last light of New Year's Eve faded into the horizon as they parked on a desolate country road. The chill of the winter evening crept through the air, biting at their faces as they stepped out into the gathering darkness. The silence of the countryside was profound, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on frost-covered grass. Vandar led the way, holding Shania's small bag slung over one shoulder and the strange metal bracelet clutched tightly in his hand. Behind him, Teresa cradled Shania, who had fallen asleep despite the cold, while Gino trudged along, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows that flitted among the trees. Why does he keep holding that thing? Gino muttered to himself, watching Vandar glance down at the bracelet every few steps. He made a mental note to ask about it later, assuming there was a later. They emerged from the forest into an open field. The mist clung low to the ground, obscuring the contours of the land and swallowing any sign of distant hills. Vandar stopped abruptly and turned to the others, pointing toward a cluster of willows by a shallow river. "There," he said, "we'll stay under the trees." The final rays of twilight faded as they reached the grove. Vandar turned off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. When they looked up, they were met with a breathtaking sight. The night sky stretched above them in pristine clarity, the Milky Way blazing a brilliant trail across the heavens. For a moment, even Gino was struck speechless. "What now?" he finally whispered, his voice barely carrying over the soft rustle of the breeze. Vandar's face was grave as he spoke. "We stay here. Don't move. Don't make a sound. If we're seen, it could mean the end for all of us." "Seen by who?" Gino asked, his breath visible in the cold air. "The ley lines are guarded," Vandar replied quietly, "by the Carnos." Gino's brow furrowed. "The who?" "The Carnos," Vandar said again. "Sworn law-keepers of the time gates. They patrol every New Year's Eve across every year of history, searching for anomalies like us, those trying to escape the reset." Gino shook his head in disbelief. "And here I thought you were the madman in this family," he muttered, glancing at Teresa. "Now I see it runs in the blood." Teresa ignored his remark, her voice calm but firm. "Papa, just listen to Vandar, please." Gino sighed, crouching behind the thick trunk of a willow tree. Teresa curled protectively around Shania, holding her close to shield her from the cold. Vandar stood a short distance away, glancing between the bracelet in his hand and the watch on his wrist. 5 minutes, he said under his breath. A distant pop echoed through the air, fireworks from some nearby village. The faint glow of sparks briefly illuminated the horizon before fading into darkness. Vandar tensed. 1 minute, he whispered. The air grew heavy, and a low hum began to resonate through the ground. Gino clung to the rough bark of the tree as the stars above seemed to shift, their brightness intensifying until the night sky looked alive. The Milky Way spun faster, its stars streaking into long trails of colored light that swirled like a cosmic whirlpool. "Look," Vandar whispered, pointing upward. The heavens themselves appeared to break apart. Light cascaded from the sky in shimmering ribbons, illuminating the grove in hues of gold, blue, and green. The ground beneath them trembled as the wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a sound like distant thunder. Gino's heart pounded as he watched, torn between awe and terror. Then came the light. A sharp green glow pierced through the swirling chaos, emanating from the far side of the grove. Vandar stiffened, his body rigid with tension. He turned toward the source, his face grim. "It's here," he muttered. From the center of the glow, a figure emerged. It floated just above the ground, its form clad in armor that seemed to radiate its own light. The armor resembled that of a medieval knight, but it was impossibly sleek, its surface etched with glowing lines that pulsed faintly. The figure was massive, at least 7 feet tall, and moved with an eerie, deliberate grace. Above its outstretched hands hovered 2 orbs of fire, their orange glow casting flickering shadows across the trees. Vandar gritted his teeth. "Stay hidden," he hissed. The Carnos drifted closer, scanning the grove. Its glowing eyes swept methodically through the darkness, searching. Vandar knew it wouldn't be long before they were found. He glanced at Teresa, who clutched Shania tightly, her face pale but composed. Gino, on the other hand, was frozen in terror, his wide eyes locked on the advancing figure. Vandar reached into his bag, pulling out a pistol-like weapon. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. Then, with a yell, he leapt from behind the tree and fired. The blast struck the Carnos square in the chest, sending it hurtling backward. It recovered almost instantly, its fiery orbs flaring as it turned its glowing eyes on Vandar. With a sweep of its arms, the orbs shot forward, streaking through the air like flaming meteors. Vandar dove to the side as the orbs smashed into the ground where he'd stood, sending a shower of dirt and sparks into the air. He rolled to his feet just in time to see the Carnos charging toward him, a glowing sword drawn from its back. He fired again, 2 shots deflected by the Carnos' sword in brilliant bursts of light. The third shot found its mark, striking the center of its helmet. The creature froze mid-step, its glowing eyes flickering before fading entirely. With a metallic groan, it collapsed to the ground, its fiery orbs sputtering out like dying embers. Vandar lowered his weapon, his chest heaving. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the darkened armor. "Teresa!" he called, turning toward the grove. She emerged cautiously, Shania still in her arms. "We're okay," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you?" Vandar nodded, pulling her into an embrace. "Gino," he called. From behind a tree, Gino staggered out, his face pale and his hands trembling. "I'm here," he rasped. I think I'm okay." Vandar let out a breath of relief. "We have to go," he said. "Now." The car sped through the darkness, the tension inside palpable. Gino sat in silence, his hands gripping his knees. Teresa hummed softly to calm Shania, who had woken during the chaos. "Are we safe now?" Gino finally asked. Vandar didn't take his eyes off the road. "We're safe for now. But when the Carnos doesn't report back, others will come. We need to stay off their radar." Teresa frowned. "And next year?" Vandar hesitated. "We can't return to the same ley lines. It's too dangerous. They'll be waiting for us." "Next year?" Gino repeated, slumping in his seat. "You mean we'll have to do this all over again?" Vandar glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Until the time gates no longer control us, we're fugitives. This is the only way." Gino said nothing, the weight of the night settling over him like a shroud. Chapter 10. The trip back to London was cloaked in silence. The car's engine hummed softly as the suburbs of the city began to emerge in the distance, their warm lights casting faint glows on the frost-covered streets. Gino stared out the window, his thoughts a chaotic blur, his jaw clenched in frustration. He didn't speak until the familiar outline of the Language Institute came into view. "Can we stop here? I need to pick up my briefcase," he said, his voice low and tense. Vandar gave a slight nod, saying nothing as he pulled into the same parking spot. Gino stepped out, his movements heavy, and climbed to the stairs without waiting for an offer of help. From the driver's seat, Vandar watched him go. "He's not taking this well," he said, breaking the silence. Teresa sighed, her gaze lingering on the building. "It's a lot to process," she replied. "I took time too. He'll come around once he starts to understand the freedom we've gained." Vandar opened the door and got out, glancing up the stairs. "Should I go after him?" She hesitated, then nodded. "You should. He may not ask for help, but he needs it." Gino reached the reception desk, where the young receptionist greeted him with a practiced smile. Her bright ruby lipstick seemed almost garish against the building's stark lighting. "Yes, we were hoping you'd come back," she said, reaching under the desk to retrieve his briefcase. "Thank you," Gino said stiffly, taking it from her. At that moment, Vandar appeared behind him. Gino tensed, but didn't turn around. As if sensing the tension, the Institute's manager, Mr. Walker, stepped out of his office with a jovial smile. "Ah, Senor Forlanini," he exclaimed. "Happy New Year. I trust you've come for your briefcase." "Yes, Happy New Year," Gino replied, his politeness strained. "And yes, I have it now." "You got everything?" Vandar asked softly. Gino glanced inside the briefcase, nodding. "No problems." Walker's gaze shifted to Vandar, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Is this your son, Senor Forlanini?" "No," Gino replied, forcing a smile. "My son-in-law." Walker blinked in surprise. "I didn't know you had a daughter." "You met Vandar on the 31st, Gino said. "We came in together." Walker's smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. "I'm sorry, but you were alone." "Alone?" Gino echoed, his voice rising. "Yes," Walker said, nodding firmly. The receptionist chimed in with agreement. "It was just you," she said. "No, no," Gino said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Vandar was with me. We spoke to you in your office. You even asked him where he met my daughter." Walker exchanged an uncertain glance with the receptionist before turning back to Gino. "I'm sorry, Senor Forlanini, but I don't recall that at all." Gino turned to Vandar, his expression a mix of anger and betrayal. Vandar shrugged helplessly. "Well," Gino said tightly, "I'll be on my way." Clutching his briefcase, he walked past Vandar and out of the building without another word. The moment Gino slammed the car door, the tension erupted. "What the hell was that?" he yelled, his face red with frustration. "What's going on?" Teresa turned in her seat, startled. "What's wrong?" Vandar remained calm, glancing at her. "He's just seen the effects of the time gates." "What are you talking about?" Gino shouted, his voice shaking. "Those two, Walker and that receptionist, they're crazy. They met Vandar, but now they're acting like he doesn't exist." Teresa reached out and placed a hand on her father's arm. "Papa, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Gino snapped. "That I'm losing my mind? No," she said firmly. "They can't remember Vandar because to them, he doesn't exist in the year that's just passed." "Doesn't exist?" Gino repeated, his voice trembling. "How is that even possible?" She took a deep breath, her voice calm and measured. "The time gates reset history every New Year's Eve. They restore the timeline to how it should have been, according to their design. Anything outside of that, like Vandar being in that office, is erased." Gino stared at her, his confusion turning to anger. "So none of this happened? Is that what you're saying?" "It happened," Vandar interjected. "But only to us. To the rest of the world, it didn't." Teresa leaned forward, her tone softening. "In the original version of 1994, Papa, you didn't come to London. You didn't meet Vandar. You spent New Year's Eve in Arezzo, drinking wine and dancing in the piazza. That's the version of history the time gates restored." Gino slumped back in his seat, his head in his hands. "This is insane. Completely insane." Vandar's voice was calm but firm. "You're an anomaly now, Gino, like us, living outside the time gate's control." Gino suddenly straightened, his eyes blazing. "So, now I don't even belong to 1994? Fine, just fine. Why didn't you warn me about this earlier?" Before Vandar could respond, Gino threw open the car door and stormed out, narrowly avoiding an oncoming car. He stomped down the street, muttering curses under his breath. "Damn it," Vandar muttered, gripping the steering wheel. "Give him space," Teresa said quietly, her hand on his shoulder. "He needs time to process." Vandar shook his head. "We can't leave him wandering around. If he talks to the wrong person, the Carnos could find us." Teresa sighed. "You're right. Go after him. I'll stay here." Vandar nodded, quickly getting out of the car. He jogged after Gino, who had entered the sprawling expanse of Richmond Park, his dark figure silhouetted against the misty evening light. Gino wandered through the park, his footsteps heavy. His thoughts raced, bouncing between anger, disbelief, and fear. Finally, he stopped beneath a towering oak, pressing his forehead against the rough bark. "What's happening to me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Vandar approached cautiously, his own breath visible in the cold air. He didn't speak at first, giving Gino the space to vent his frustration. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice calm but resolute. "I know how you feel, Gino. I've been there." Gino didn't respond, but Vandar pressed on. "Your world feels like it's falling apart because it's not what you thought it was. I know how disorienting that is, but it's also an opportunity." Gino turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowed. "An opportunity? For what?" Vandar stepped closer, his expression earnest. "To live outside their control, to be free. But I need you to trust me. I need your help." Gino finally turned to face him, his anger softening into wary curiosity. "Am I free now?" he asked quietly. "Free from the time gates?" Vandar looked away, his voice heavy with regret. "Not yet, but we're working on it.